Avoidants don't pull away because they don't care. They pull away because closeness feels emotionally overwhelming. And to understand this, you have to step inside the emotional experience of someone who has learned, often very young, that connection is not the same as safety. For many avoidant individuals, closeness has historically come with strings attached, expectations they couldn't meet, emotional demands that felt too heavy, or vulnerability that led to hurt, shame, or abandonment. So they learned to survive by minimizing needs, minimizing feelings, and minimizing dependency. They learned that the easiest way to stay safe was to stay slightly out of reach. When they start to feel close to someone, something complex happens internally. Emotionally, they may feel warmth, attachment, attraction, and care. But physiologically, their body responds as if they're walking into a burning room. Their nervous system goes into alert, the heart rate increases. There is a sense of losing control. It is not logical. It is not a reflection of how they feel about you. It is a protective reflex built from years of conditioning. So the moment they begin to sense closeness deepening, a deep conversation, a vulnerable moment, a feeling of emotional reliance, they instinctively take a step back. They seek space not to escape the person, but to regain internal balance. This is why avoidants often seem contradictory. They may show affection, initiate connection, enjoy intimacy, and then suddenly go cold or distant. To someone who doesn't understand this dynamic, it feels personal. It feels like rejection. It feels like the affection was fake, or temporary, or only convenient in the moment. But internally for the avoidant, the distance is a form of self-preservation. They retreat to breathe, to regulate, to bring themselves back to emotional neutrality where they feel safe again. They have learned to trust distance. Distance has always been the space where they could think clearly, where they didn't feel consumed by expectation, where they could maintain their sense of identity. For them, closeness often feels like the beginning of losing themselves. When you get close, they may fear being emotionally engulfed or controlled or judged or dependent. They fear being vulnerable to disappointment or abandonment. So they try to preserve their independence by withdrawing for a moment, a day, a week, sometimes longer. This behavior is a response to internal overwhelm, not a lack of attachment. The closer they feel to someone, the stronger the overwhelm can become. When they start to feel they could rely on you emotionally, their alarm system activates. To them, reliance equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals risk. Their body says, protect yourself, step back, create space. So they disconnect temporarily, not because they want to leave, but because they need to regain emotional equilibrium before they can show up again. The difficult part is that avoidants rarely communicate this process. They don't say, I need space to calm my emotional system. They don't explain the internal struggle or the rush of anxiety they feel when emotional closeness deepens. They simply pull back. And because they don't verbalize what they're experiencing, the other person often interprets the withdrawal as disinterest, disrespect, or emotional immaturity. But the avoidant is usually fighting a battle they don't have language for. Many of them don't even consciously understand that they are overwhelmed. They only know they suddenly need distance. Avoidants also have a complicated relationship with emotions. They are not emotionless, and they are not detached from feeling. In many cases, they feel deeply, sometimes even more deeply than people who express emotions freely. But their coping mechanism is to push those feelings away to avoid being consumed by them. So when attachment feelings rise, longing, affection, excitement, desire, the intensity of these emotions can feel threatening. They shut down or detach as a way to regain emotional control. This is why avoidants often feel safest in relationships where emotions are present but not intense. They prefer slow, steady connection where neither person is overly expressive or demanding. They thrive when affection is shown gently rather than dramatically, when reassurance comes through consistency rather than emotional intensity. They can love, and they do love, but their love is often quiet, cautious, and gradual. Avoidants also associate closeness with expectations. If someone gets too emotionally close, they may fear that the other person will begin to require constant reassurance, constant communication, constant involvement. They fear being responsible for another person's emotional well-being. So when they sense someone becoming deeply attached, they may distance themselves to prevent the relationship from escalating to a level that feels unsustainable for them. The irony is that avoidants often want connection. They want to be understood, valued, and loved. They want to share their life with someone, but they want connection without the feeling of being trapped inside it. They want intimacy without emotional overwhelm. They want closeness without the fear that getting close means losing themselves or being hurt. This creates a pattern where they may move toward you and then away in cycles. They lean in when they feel emotionally safe, when the connection feels light, when there is no pressure. They withdraw when the emotional stakes rise or when they sense expectations they fear they can't meet. To someone on the outside, this looks inconsistent, but inside the avoidant, it feels like the only way to love without drowning. There is also a deep desire to be chosen for who they are, not for what they provide emotionally. They are sensitive to feeling pursued for needs rather than for connection. When someone wants emotional closeness from them too quickly, they may feel like they are being valued only as a source of emotional fulfillment. That pressure makes them retreat. But when someone values them for their presence, their ideas, their personality, their humor, their existence, not just their emotional availability, they feel safe enough to stay. Understanding this dynamic does not mean excusing emotional unavailability, nor does it mean sacrificing your own emotional needs. But recognizing the internal experience of the avoidant helps remove the personalization. The withdrawal is not an indictment of your worth, your desirability, or your lovability. It is an emotional coping pattern formed long before you arrived. It is a reflex, not a rejection. It is a response to overwhelm, not a lack of care. And when closeness deepens, the inner alarm that says protect yourself can become louder than the desire to move closer. Their silence can be a signal, not of rejection, but of fear and emotional overload. To understand this, we have to recognize that silence in relationships does not always mean absence. Sometimes silence is a language. Sometimes silence is the nervous system speaking when the mouth cannot. Avoidant individuals often retreat into silence not as a punishment, not as a manipulation, and not as a withdrawal of love, but as a way to regain emotional stability when the intensity of connection becomes too overwhelming to process all at once. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, silence is the emotional equivalent of putting a hand on the brake before the car goes too fast. When emotional closeness increases, whether through a deep conversation, a vulnerable moment, or simply the experience of feeling genuinely seen, there can be a sudden surge of internal intensity. This intensity is not always pleasant. Even joy and attachment can feel threatening if someone has learned that connection comes with risk. Their mind may start spinning with questions. What does this mean? What is expected of me now? Will I have to show more than I am ready to show? What if I can't give what they need? What if I lose myself? These questions create emotional overload, and the avoidant nervous system responds by shutting down communication temporarily. Silence in this context is not empty. It is full of processing, regulating, sorting, and containing. It is the mind trying to hold emotional flooding at bay. Picture someone turning down the volume on everything around them, not because they want to disconnect from the song, but because the sound was too loud to bear in the moment. Avoidants were often raised in environments where emotional expression was not met with safety, empathy, or support. Maybe feelings were dismissed, minimized, mocked, or ignored. Maybe they were taught explicitly or implicitly that vulnerability makes you weak, dependent, or inconvenient. So they learned to internalize emotions instead of verbalizing them. Silence became the shelter. Silence became the protection. Silence became the shield. So when they go silent in a relationship, they are not doing it to hurt you. They are retreating into the coping strategy that has always kept them safe. Silence feels familiar. Silence feels controlled. Silence feels like something they can manage. Words, on the other hand, might feel like exposure. They may fear that if they speak while emotionally overwhelmed, they will either say too much, say the wrong thing, or open a door to needs they do not know how to meet. So they choose silence because silence feels safer than being deeply seen. This silence also reflects the internal tension between wanting closeness and fearing it. Avoidants are not indifferent. They are not numb. They often experience longing and desire for connection, but these feelings coexist with an instinct to protect their emotional autonomy. When closeness intensifies, they may feel like they are on the verge of losing control of their internal world. Silence becomes a pause, a necessary breath, a recalibration. Their silence also serves as a test, not consciously, but emotionally. It is a test of whether the other person will react with pressure, anger, or abandonment. Deep down, avoidants fear that if someone truly sees them, their anxieties, their limitations, their slowness to open, that person will leave. So when they go silent, they are watching, not for dramatic proof of devotion, but for emotional steadiness. They are observing whether the other person can hold space without demanding quick emotional availability. Avoidants often worry that if they speak before they are emotionally regulated, they will be misunderstood. They may fear that expressing confusion, fear, or internal conflict will lead to misinterpretation or intensified emotional demands from the other person. Silence becomes a way to prevent escalation. Silence becomes the buffer that allows emotional intensity to cool to a level they can handle. This is why avoidants often return once they have regained internal stability. They needed time to process, not distance to detach. To the partner, however, this silence can feel like abandonment. The absence of communication can trigger anxiety, insecurity, and self-doubt. The partner may start to wonder whether they did something wrong or whether the avoidant has lost interest or is withdrawing love. But the avoidant's silence is not communicating "I don't care." It is communicating "I need space to feel safe inside myself again." What makes this dynamic difficult is that the avoidant rarely explains what is happening. They do not say, "I am overwhelmed and need time to stabilize my emotions." Instead, they simply become quiet. And because silence is ambiguous, the partner fills it with fear. Misinterpretation grows not from lack of love, but from lack of verbal clarity. Inside the avoidant, there is often a deeply internalized belief that if they need space, they must take it without asking. Asking for space feels like admitting emotional need. Admitting emotional need feels vulnerable. Vulnerability feels dangerous. So silence becomes the unspoken method of self-preservation. It is not graceful, and it is not easy for the partner to navigate, but it is the avoidant's nervous system doing what it learned to do long before the relationship began. It is also important to understand that avoidants do not always recognize that they are overwhelmed. They may simply feel numb, foggy, irritable, or shut down. They may not consciously be aware of the fear beneath the silence. They may just feel the impulse to withdraw without having language for why. Their emotional awareness often develops slower than their emotional reactions. Silence gives them time for awareness to catch up. Their silence is full of unsaid things, hesitations, questions, hopes, fears, unfinished thoughts. It holds the weight of wanting closeness and the fear of being consumed by it. Silence is their temporary shelter when the world of feeling becomes too sharp, too bright, too close. It is not the absence of love, but the attempt to hold love at a distance where it does not overwhelm or destabilize their internal sense of self. Pressuring or chasing pushes them further away. Calm presence invites them back. To understand why, you have to understand the internal emotional mechanics of an avoidant person. When someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to feel closeness, vulnerability, or emotional exposure, their nervous system interprets the experience not as comfort, but as pressure. It doesn't matter how gentle the other person thinks they are being. The avoidant person experiences emotional intensity like a rising wave they are not sure they know how to swim in. When someone begins to chase them, texting repeatedly, asking what's wrong, trying to fix the silence, or pushing for emotional clarity, the avoidant does not experience this as love. They experience it as a threat to their emotional independence. Their sense of self is deeply tied to not feeling dependent on someone else for emotional stability. So any attempt to pull them closer when they are already overwhelmed feels like being psychologically crowded, even suffocated. The instinctive reaction is to withdraw further, to preserve identity, autonomy, and emotional control. This is not rational in the sense of being consciously calculated. It is reflexive, shaped by years of emotional conditioning. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs were dismissed, shamed, or ignored. They learned to handle everything internally. When someone tries to get inside their emotional space without permission, it triggers a memory of being exposed or intruded upon. So when they feel pursued, they retreat, because retreating is the only way they have ever known to stay emotionally safe. Chasing also creates an energy dynamic that feels uneven. When one person is pursuing and the other is withdrawing, the relationship becomes unbalanced. The avoidant begins to feel like the other person's emotional well-being depends on them responding. That activates fear. Fear of failing someone else emotionally. Fear of being expected to give more than they can. Fear of disappointing someone. And disappointment for them is tied to a deep sense of personal inadequacy. To prevent that emotional burden, they create distance. Pressure signals danger to an avoidant nervous system. Not physical danger, but emotional overwhelm. Emotional pressure can look like asking repeatedly for reassurance, demanding emotional transparency, insisting on immediate resolution of conflict, interpreting distance as rejection and reacting intensely, calling or texting multiple times without space, asking them to define feelings before they process them. These behaviors often come from insecurity or fear of loss on the other person's side. But to the avoidant, it feels like being forced to share a room where there is no air. Their instinct is to move away to breathe. On the other hand, calm presence communicates something entirely different. Calm presence says, I am here, but I am not pushing. I value you, but I do not need to control your emotional pace. I respect your internal process, even if I do not understand it fully. This is the environment where avoidance feels safe enough to return, not because they are being pulled, but because they are being given the freedom to choose connection rather than feel trapped inside it. Calm presence looks like responding rather than reacting, allowing silence without assuming the worst, keeping emotional tone steady and open, giving space without disappearing, showing care without urgency, communicating from groundedness rather than fear. This does not mean suppressing your needs. It means expressing them in a way that does not overwhelm. It means holding emotional steadiness, not emotional intensity. Avoidance can connect deeply when they do not feel responsible for managing someone else's emotional world. When someone stays grounded, the avoidant nervous system slowly begins to relax. The threat of engulfment fades. They feel like they have room to breathe, room to think, room to feel. And this room is what allows them to move toward connection rather than run from it. They will take longer to process emotions because emotions come to them in layers they unpack slowly. When there is no pressure, the internal fear quiets, and they can return to the relationship from a place of intention rather than defensiveness. It's also important to understand that avoidants often need to regulate themselves alone before they can re-engage. They are not processing feelings in real time through conversation the way an anxious partner might. They process alone first, reflect, come to internal clarity, and only then are able to communicate. If pressured to speak before that clarity forms, they shut down. Calm presence allows them to re-enter connection without losing their internal grounding. There is another element at play: self-trust. Avoidants often do not trust their emotional responses. They worry that if they move closer, they will get consumed by emotional expectations. When the other person is calm, steady, and self-contained, the avoidant begins to trust that the relationship will not swallow them. They begin to believe they can stay close and still remain themselves. That is what allows closeness to grow. Chasing communicates urgency. Urgency communicates emotional threat. Calm presence communicates choice. Choice communicates safety. And safety is the only route to intimacy for someone who fears being emotionally overwhelmed. The paradox is that the more someone tries to hold on tightly to an avoidant, the more that person slips away. But when someone says, with their energy rather than their words, I don't need to force this connection to keep it, the avoidant is drawn back toward them, not by pressure, but by the freedom to breathe inside the connection. When an avoidant wants you, they return gradually. Consistency is the true sign of emotional investment. Understanding this requires shifting how we interpret emotional signals. Avoidant individuals rarely move toward connection in dramatic, sweeping ways. Their attachment system does not express love loudly. They do not rush into declarations, constant communication, or immediate emotional availability. Instead, they move in slow steps. They test the environment with small returns, subtle gestures, and quiet presence. Their investment is not revealed in how intensely they express affection, but in whether they keep coming back, even after creating distance. Avoidants live in a push-pull dynamic. When they begin to feel emotionally close, that closeness may activate internal alarms. They withdraw to regain emotional equilibrium. But if they care, if they are genuinely attached, they do not disappear forever. They find their way back. The return may be subtle, a message, a question, a photo reaction, a check-in, a shared memory brought up randomly. These gestures are often small, but they are significant. They communicate that the connection still matters, even if they cannot step fully into closeness all at once. Avoidants return gradually because they need to feel safe as they re-enter emotional proximity. Safety for them is not about reassurance or promises. It is about not feeling overwhelmed. Returning gradually allows them to feel in control of their emotional experience. If they return too quickly, they fear they will lose themselves. So they re-engage step by step, gauging the emotional tone each time. They are checking, is it safe to be close here? Will I be swallowed by expectations? Will I be judged if I'm not emotionally fluent? Will I be asked to give more than I can? They look for consistency, not loud love, not intensity, not dramatic devotion. They look for emotional steadiness, someone who does not panic when they step back, someone who does not chase, pressure, or demand more than they can offer, someone who remains warm, open, and grounded. This consistency communicates that the relationship can exist without emotional urgency, and this is the space in which avoidants can let themselves attach more fully. Their consistency is different from what many people are used to recognizing as affection. They may show up in practical ways. They may remember small details. They may offer help when it's needed. They may share something personal, even if it's just a small piece. Opening up for them is done in increments. Every shared thought or vulnerable comment is deliberate. The pace is slow because they are working through layers of internal defenses built over years of emotional self-protection. Many avoidants were conditioned to believe that emotional closeness comes with obligation. They may fear being depended on or being needed in ways they cannot sustain. Gradual return allows them to monitor the relationship dynamic so they do not feel trapped. If you look closely, when they begin to feel safe, their nervous system softens. They may reach out first. They may initiate plans. They may check in without prompting. They may start to ask more personal questions. These are signs of real investment. Avoidants rarely say, "I missed you." Instead, they appear. They participate. They share space again. Their presence is their expression of attachment. The consistency of return matters more than emotional display. If they consistently re-enter the connection, it means they care. It means the relationship is not only meaningful, but manageable for them. Love for them is not a flood. It is a quiet, repeated step towards someone they trust. It is also important to understand that avoidants do not trust emotional consistency automatically. They watch over time. They look for patterns. They look at how you respond to their distance. If you meet their distance with anger, panic, or accusations, it confirms their fear that closeness leads to emotional entanglement and loss of autonomy. But if you respond with steady, grounded presence, meaning you do not withdraw in retaliation and you do not pressure them to return faster, they learn that the relationship can stretch and contract without breaking.